Jet 6, Jet 7, Jet 8, Jet 9, Jet 10. All right. As I was saying, how about those Chechens? Let's see here. Is this the one? Here's what I'll say about those Chechens. Culture is a virus. And if you understand these things mimetically, these kids who've been here for 10 years, theoretically assimilating to American culture, but still being influenced by folks from the old country, or even a minimal contact from the old country, that's still invisible to the FBI. Even when the Russians give you a warning about these folks and you ask them questions and you can't find nothing, maybe you ain't looking in the right direction. I'm just saying. And it's interesting, just like with Oklahoma City, when CNN says, oh, they're brown people. Again, no, they're Caucasian, okay? Who would do that? Why does Al-Qaeda care about the Boston Marathon? Seriously? Really? No, that's not it. So, mimetically, like a virus, spreads invisibly, unless you're looking for it. And so sometimes what happens, culture's a virus that adapts its host, or its host adapts to certain survival conditions, or survival in less optimal conditions. These folks still, as immigrants, still had a fairly sheltered and privileged lifestyle. They seem to be assimilating into American culture. But somehow an old survival pattern got injected within their consciousness and started replicating in a way that was very similar to, we'll see how this plays out, but it's very, very similar to Timothy McVeigh, where you basically have to look at what is it about American culture that makes people violent in this particular way. Now, it's still my thesis, and I'm considered crazy, so you can take it with a grain of salt, that these school shooters are not abnormal and they are not mentally ill. When they were bombing churches, when they were killing civil rights folks, they were normal, socialized, patriotic Americans. That nothing was done about them. They weren't considered mentally ill. But now that they're targeting Americans, now they're mentally ill. But they weren't mentally ill when they were basically working against civil rights. But now they're targeting Americans, now they're mentally ill. I think it's basically the same violent meme. Is all. So, let's continue with, we're going to start with World War II, because I want you to be able to pass the midterm. Wouldn't you? In 2 weeks? Don't be scared. It's all right. It's take home open book. You just have to remember certain things before you got here, before you were born.
You've got a great book going there.
Huh?
You've got a great...
I know, I just got to convert it
Man,
from PowerPoint to
I know
a book.
You've already got it written, don't you?
Yeah.
You said it?
I know, just have to change formats.
I'll buy one.
All right. Physical book or iTunes?
Okay.
All right. Aluta continue. The struggle continues. So, World War II. Now, when they talk about world wars, it's not that the planet is involved with a war. It's just that what they consider the planet, the important parts of the planet, are involved with the war. All right? So part of the African American experience, serving your country while your country deserts you. Again. So I love America, but I'm quoting the Delaney sisters, two African American professionals who died at past 100. I love America, but America doesn't always love me back. So Sadie and Bessie Delaney, 104 and 103 years young. I love America, but America doesn't love me back. I never let prejudice stop me from what I want to do in this life. Sadie Delaney. So here's the thing that I was attempting to teach a young white middle-class occupier who will remain unnamed. It is one thing to pass out a pamphlet at the Social Justice, Real Justice conference talking about the history of racism in Eugene. That's one thing. But what you are missing is the fact that people have resisted and thrived despite that. And that's the story you should be focusing on. That's the story we would focus on. Basically, to say that there's racism in Eugene is like saying there's smog in Los Angeles. So, is it a good smog day or a bad smog day? You still have to live with it. And other people have observed, hey, if you can make it in this town, in this state, dealing with the atmosphere of systemic discrimination, you can make it anywhere. Especially in places where it's more in your face, which is still true as well. So, the Delaney sisters and others basically give us the example of how you deal with it. So let's talk about the war. So when we talk about the war, which war are we talking about? Not just World War II, but which war do you think about?
Well, the Great War was World War I.
The Great War is World War I if you're a certain age. All right, you folks younger than me and Tim. What war is that? World War II. Okay, you're from North Africa, so it was fought in your country or near your country. So yeah, you'd be aware of that, all right? How about you Americans? Which war?
Vietnam.
What was that?
You already know the shoe game.
Already what?
Civil War.
Civil War, okay. I remember picking up my then teenage kid sister from Westwood Village in Los Angeles, and a Paul McCartney and Wings song came on, and she asked me, Paul McCartney was in a group before Wings, wasn't he? I go, yeah, the Beatles. And I said, yeah, the last time we were listening to the Beatles, last time I was actually up here in Westwood, we were doing an anti-war protest. And she goes, we were at war? I go, yeah, right. The war in Vietnam. Yes, we were in war. Okay, so my kid sister didn't even know about Vietnam. That's like history to her. Then, right? So, which war becomes really a salient point? Now, you know about the war on terror, right? Theoretically. Okay, so the question you ask about the war, well, which war are you talking about? Against who? For what reason? How many of you have read George Orwell's 1984? Again, this is like a generation gap thing. Right? Because when we were in school, I won't speak to how old Tim is, but when I was in school, we read 1984, because 1984 hadn't happened yet. And in George Orwell's book, 1984, which is a dystopian future. So dystopia means it's a bad future, but it's written in, his present, which I think he wrote that just before World War II. projecting into the future what 1984 was going to be. Basically a totalitarian state with, television and basically mind control and people informing on each other and all that other kind of stuff. And we were going to be in perpetual war with one country or another. And then they would erase the history to justify the current war so that people would think we'd always been at war with this country, when actually a few years back we had been allies with that country against somebody else. All right? So, which war? Against who? For what reason? And what outcome? So, the war. Their side. The American Revolutionary War. Right? Britain and 100,000 loyalists in this country. U.S. invasion of Mexico. That's another war. Okay? Where the U.S. invaded Mexico. And that invasion, basically, the U.S. won and gets the Republic of Texas, New Mexico, the Republic of California, and every other state with a Spanish name. Colorado, all that was Mexico. Then after that, what's called on their side, the War of Northern Aggression, which on the West Coast, we know as the Civil War. Then, the Spanish-American War, where we're fighting Spain for Cuba, the Philippines, Hawaii, Guahan. Notice the pronunciation there, Guahan. That's actually how the indigenous people, the Chamorro, pronounce it. Guahan, not Guam. Guahan. And then World War I, their side, the Central Powers, that is German, the German Empire, the Austria-Hungarian and Ottoman Empire. That's World War I. So our side, that is our in parentheses, the War of Independence. And our side, the British colonies on North America, and France, with France as an ally. Also on their side, I should mention the Hessians, who were German mercenaries. Okay, because the king on the British throne was from Germany, House of Hanover.
And it was the fall of the Habsburgs was interpreted in that.
Fall of the Habsburgs, that's also a reigning family in the Austro-Hungarian side, the Habsburgs.
And it was the end of the monarchs.
Yes.
that were-
What you were seeing was the end of genetically passed on monarchies. Kings passing on the ruling power to their kids. Mexican-American War, Civil War, War between the states, Spanish-American War, 1898, World War I, the Great War, so-called the war to end all wars, which was basically the Allied powers, the United Kingdom, Britain, France, Russia, and the US. And the war, World War II, the Axis, USSR and the Allies against world communism. So other wars we're talking about. World War II Allies were basically the United States and its allies. Then there's also the Cold War, the Korean War, Vietnam, the war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war on terror, the Long War, which basically is an extension of the war on terror. Could be a holy war, depends. So looking at whoever the war is, the war shifts based on who is the enemy. Like, it ain't ever over. It just shifts. Very much like Orwell kind of predicted in 1984.
That's how you control people inside America, by telling them there's an enemy and broad freedom. That's kind of dogma.
Yeah, not just America, but America is definitely a very good, the events of this last week with Boston have been very interesting. Like, what's it like being under martial law, and how much do you like being under martial law when it happens? Yeah, so that was kind of scary for some folks, but it's interesting. That's martial law, essentially.
It's an erosion of your civil liberties.
Could be, right. Because it's not just about whether, the 19-year-old kid gets his Miranda rights read. It's like, okay, we can suspend these because in the interest of public safety, and we'll just do federal charges, which means we can kill him.
That's the capital punishment.
Capital punishment.
There's no capital punishment in Massachusetts otherwise.
Right. But they can basically do him like Tim McVeigh. All right? So, the war shifts. So, in dichotomous logic, it teaches you to choose sides. If you're not with us, you're against us. Huh? So the World War II allies, the US, Britain, France, Russia, Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, China, Denmark, Greece, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Poland, South Africa, Yugoslavia. Now, notice in those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 countries. That isn't the planet. That isn't the world. All right? In the UN today, there's over 200 countries. So we haven't even approached 10% of the countries. The UN hasn't formed at this time period. But it isn't even 10% of the countries fighting. How is it a world war? Well, it's, quote unquote, our world.
Well, the Security Council is only 5 countries, too.
It's 7 now, I think.
7,
Yeah. But yes. Right. So the axis: Germany, Italy, Japan, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. So 17 countries against 6 countries. And then when we talk about the axis of evil, when Bush was talking about that in the time period we haven't gotten you to, so Iraq, Iran, North Korea. All right. The birthers are, well, yeah, they are white, but right. Barack Hussein Obama is not an American because, according to international law, Hawaii is not a state, but an illegally occupied sovereign territory taken by military force, which the indigenous Hawaiians consciously never resisted upon the orders of their queen. So technically, Hawaii is not part of the United States via international law, but nobody's going to try and take Hawaii from us while we got nukes. Right? So we can decide that it's a state. Just like we can decide that Mexico, oh, well, Mexico lost the war, so California is part of America now. Same principle. But according to, and I'll explain this in terms of international law, okay? Hawaii was a sovereign country recognized by European powers, among other things, among other countries, as well as the United States. But it was strategically placed, especially during the Spanish-American War, so we needed it as a military base and basically engineered its takeover. Now, according to international law, if you resist a military occupation and you lose, you lose. But if you do not resist, the occupation is illegal. The Hawaiians didn't resist upon the orders of their queen. Okay, so the United States still took over it militarily. So if this appeared on the midterm near you, you know the correct answer as far as I'm concerned. Okay? We were not attacked when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attacked an illegally occupied military base of the United States, not the Hawaiian people. There's a difference. All right? So, nobody's going to dispute the American claim of Hawaii being a state, because we got nukes. But that doesn't make it any more legal. Look, I love Hawaii, but I'm down with Hawaiian sovereignty. But the Hawaiians are not going to get their island back without neutralizing the nukes. They're not going to do that. And there's various reasons why they're not going to do it. So, when people talk about, especially with 9/11, like, oh, we were attacked just like we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. And so there's that old joke, you may not know the old joke if you're not of a certain age, to remember the Lone Ranger and Tonto. And the Lone Ranger says to Tonto, "Tonto, we're surrounded by Indians." And the Tonto goes, "What do you mean, we, white man?"
Now you're
Ha
gonna,
ha ha. Da-dum-dum.
now Johnny Depp is playing.
Now Johnny Depp, who actually is native, is playing Tonto. That's nice. What do you mean, we, white man? So, did the Hawaiians ask you to depose their monarchy in 1893 to protect them from Japanese tyranny? No, they did not. So, for a number of centuries, Hawaii was a sovereign nation. This is the last queen, Queen Liliuokalani. They were called, from the point of view of the British, the Sandwich Islands, after the Earl of Sandwich. Sandwich Islands were not uninhabited, no more than Guanahani Island was uninhabited at the time that Cristobal Colon made contact with the Taino nation on October 12, 1492. So in the late 19th century, it actually had a monarchy, that is, kings and queens, recognized by several European and American powers. Not necessarily that they thought of the Hawaiians being brown people as actually equal to whites, but simply because they needed a strategic port to overwinter. What is Oregon called? Beaver State, right? And so beavers were traded across the Pacific to China as well as Europe. Those ships overwintered in the Hawaiian Islands during the Pacific storms, and then groups of Hawaiian contract workers would be brought over to Oregon, which is why you have people and place names in Oregon, O-Y-E, which is Hawaii. So Hawaii was a strategic port for whaling ships, for traders, and other people overwintering in Hawaii. So this brought Hawaiians to Oregon in the early 19th century.
Sorry about that.
Sorry. So Liliuokalani was the last reigning monarch of Hawaii. And some Hawaiian royalty were really outspoken about the dangers of allowing foreign powers and business and military interests increasing their influence on the island. They were concerned about that for a number of reasons, culturally and militarily, and it turns out that they were right. So, the U.S. in particular had succeeded in passing a constitution that prevented most Hawaiians from having a vote and gave foreign, that is, white residents, voting power. So, for example, when we're looking at, though we'll look at this when we look at the time period around the Iraq War, about what happens, okay, you topple Saddam Hussein, you create a constitution. Well, who's writing that constitution? Who's building that nation? How well did Reconstruction work in the South in the United States? What kind of experience does the United States have in building nations from scratch? Well, if the Hawaiians are an example, this ain't good. The Hawaiians had been inhabiting that island for 5,000 years. How is it then the first constitution that was written prohibits Hawaiians from voting in their own homeland? It's the U.S. that does that.
Well, after the Gulf War, the first presidents in Iraq was like presidents who was American. So for 1 year,
Yeah.
just that they can be able to vote and have their own presidents.
Yeah.
And the Sunnis were a minority power, were in control of Iraq before and the Shiites are over 60% of that population. They have a limited vote, so it's still not democratic by any means.
Right. So beware of when a numeric minority has control over a majority. Be suspicious of that. So, a revolution backed by business and military interests. So, notice this word, this language, revolution. They're revolting against the royalty who are made up of the indigenous people. So, even to talk about it as a revolution, like, wait, the royalty are oppressing their own people? No, the royalty are opposed to you exploiting their homeland. So, a revolution backed by business and military interests forced her to give up her throne, and a provisional government was established, which means you overthrow the monarchy, the provisional government is going to be more business friendly. This becomes a pattern that the United States uses, not just the United States, but us in particular, uses across the world. Okay? Overthrowing democratically elected indigenous governments in favor of business. Our business. Not necessarily their business. All right, so Hawaii, notice this word, annexed to the United States 2 years later, but did not become a state until after World War II. Okay, so annex means you have the troops, your troops are quartered there, you're occupying the country, but it's not technically your territory, but you can defend it if it's military, if you are attacked militarily. So Hawaii was not part of the United States. It was annexed. Now, annexed meant that if the Hawaiian people could not vote about being annexed, they're being forced, and the only people who could vote were white foreigners, that would be Americans. Who's making the decision to have American troops on your homeland?
Old pineapple.
Dole pineapple, Californian Hawaiian sugar, CNH sugar. In the sugar plantations were people were being whipped in the sugar cane fields in the 1930s, just like slavery in the 20th century. Wait, slavery was over in the continental United States, not in Hawaii. So you can see, if you've ever met any Native Hawaiians, why they might have some feelings about being part of America and basically losing a part of their history and culture. You have basically a genocide occurred in Hawaii very similar to what happened here, except on a smaller scale, where you have 1 million Hawaiians basically being reduced to essentially less than 100,000. Or 50 to 30,000, depending on how you count. So if you remember when we talked about blood quantum, do you remember when we talked about blood quantum? You can ask me about blood quantum if you don't recall.
What's blood quantum?
Okay. Know what a red-blooded American is? A red-blooded American is a Ku Klux Klan term referring to a quote-unquote pure blood that is unmixed with any other racial minority other than white Anglo-Saxon Protestant human being. That's a red-blooded American. It's a Ku Klux Klan term. Bet you didn't know that. All right. So for hundreds of thousands of years, if you had a human mother and a human father, because by definition, biologically, you can't breed unless you're the same creature. So for 220,000 years, we're the same creature, just different phenotypes, which we subgrouped into quote-unquote races. But there's just one race, the human race. Right? So there's no pure blood anyone. Right? But you have had theories of racial discrimination based on outward characteristics. So, the original meme, if you will, came from horse breeding. Okay? In order to make a quarter horse. Now, a quarter horse is still a horse. Okay? But what it's mixed with is a full blood, what, Arab or Arabian. Okay? And another horse breed to get a quarter horse. Okay? So what you leave out, what you breed out is the intelligence of the full-blood Arabian, and you leave the stamina for racing. That's how you get a quarter horse. But in order to get a quarter horse, you have to, and get people to create a quarter horse, you need the concept of a quarter. You need to be able to teach them mathematics. Right? How do you know what a quarter horse is if you don't know what a quarter is? Right? What is a quarter coin? What is a quarter of?
$1.
And how many of them? 4 to make $1, right? Right? So you need fractions, which means you need numeracy. Right? So the basic model of slavery from the Greeks and the Romans is we need slaves that can read and write. Okay? The African model was the same. Even if you were a slave, a captive of war, we still needed you to read and write, and you had the right to access reading and writing and learning just like any other tribal member. In the year 700, the Moors had conquered Spain for the second time in history and held it for 700 years. During that time, between 711 to 1492 AD, note the date, they enslaved millions of Europeans, especially along North Africa, and also the conquered lands in Spain. And one of the things that these enslaved Europeans were doing, so slaves from the Caucasus, slaves from Turkey, slaves from Lower Russia, as well as Spain, but in particular the Caucasus. Note, watch that area, Chechnya. Okay? Not only are they fierce fighters, but they have a long history of revolting against slavery. Not just against Africans, but against Europeans, too. Russians in particular. All right? So, millions Europeans enslaved by black Africans. To raise horses, war horses, both for war and for sale. Okay? And they need to be literate and numerate. Therefore, you teach them numbers. What numbers? 1, 2, 3. We call these Arabic numerals with fractions and algebra to create quarter horses. Okay? So you breed a full-blooded Arabian with another horse, you get a half Arabian. Then you need to breed that one with another one, you get a quarter horse. Right? So you need slaves to be able to write that down to keep the records and understand the math so they can do that. So, the reason I went through all this meme originally applied to horses got transferred by Europeans and Americans into slavery. Nobody thought about there's a half-breed human. Nobody thought about that before this time. Because the concept of race didn't exist in this time. It wasn't about your race. It was where you were from. And if you were from a place which had multiple different colors within it, it wasn't about your race. It was about where you were from. You're Greek. You're Roman. You're French. You're this. You're that.
From the south.
Yeah, you're from the south, you're from the north. Where you're from, not race. So, how this got applied, let's just say with Thomas Jefferson. Where he basically applies it to black slaves. He uses the first the Portuguese slaver term, mulatto. Okay, so that's first generation black-white mix, mulatto. Okay, and then he goes quadroon. That's 1/4 black. Octoroon. One-eighth. And then you give different rights and privileges depending on how light-skinned they are. See, because actually, genetically, a mulatto can have blonde hair and blue eyes. Right? And so, basically, in the American colonies in America, how this got applied way down to 1/64th, which is the one-drop rule, which basically goes, if only one of your ancestors was a full-blood black African, you are still black, no matter what you look like. So it was used to deny rights and access. Now the reason I'm going over this is because it's a false idea, given weight by the legal system, and then got applied differently to different people. So for Native Americans, indigenous people, basically, they took this meme about race and said, okay, you ain't Indian after 1/8 anymore, or 1/16. And the idea was, we'll encourage intermarriage between male settlers and Indians, and by the time they got grandkids, their grandkids can't inherit the land anymore, and they have to give up the land. Well, they thought this was such a good idea with the Indians, because they were expecting the Indians to be gone in 2 generations. They applied it to Native Hawaiians, and basically said, past 1/2 Hawaiian, you ain't Hawaiian no more. Which, in addition to 1 million Hawaiians being reduced to less than 100,000 to 50,000 today, in less than 2 centuries. So not just because of the common cold or measles being introduced to them, but through legal means in which they say, okay, you are descendant of Hawaiian royalty, but if you're more than 1/2 Hawaiian or less than 1/2 Hawaiian, you ain't Hawaiian no more. Boom, you lose title to the land.
Did you see that movie, The Descendants?
Yeah,
And that really brings us out.
right, the descendants of George Clooney, right.
It's a really good movie, actually.
All right, so less than 1/2, not Hawaiian. So I want you to notice the logic here. There is no logic. You're still a full-blood human, no matter what your quote-unquote racial mixture is. But the law has been constructed to deny rights except to certain whites or those who conform to those certain values. All right, so there's no logic. It's not that black blood is stronger than Indian blood or Native American blood. It's that this practice is being applied to deny rights and land access and identity for the purposes of taking over the land and resources. There's no other logic to it because it doesn't make sense biologically or any other way except politically. Yes?
How did the Hawaiian react to this new race?
Oh, well, they had nothing to say about it because remember, this is in their constitution, but they didn't get to vote on that constitution. So part of what they did is have to basically absorb part of, the biases and, the educational system that was imposed upon them. I mean, part of sovereignty is basically attempting to resist those very things. So the reason I brought this up on this whole bird walk around, or Sankofa bird walk around Hawaii is, what has happened to Hawaii is basically just like the rest of the history of the United States, except more recently, certainly within my lifetime. All right, so she's remembered, Liliuokalani is remembered, in addition to being the last monarch, is the composer of over 200 traditional Hawaiian songs, including Aloha Oe, which is still popular today. All right, so Hawaiian sovereignty, of course, is still a very hot topic today for a variety of reasons. So I always like looking at the other side's view, and the other side as represented by the U.S. Navy. So when Queen Liliuokalani was dethroned in the Palace Revolution of 1893, the military influence of the USS Boston and Honolulu Harbor ensured its success. So this is from a Navy website. In 1895, when the Royalists attempted a counter-revolution in American warships' presence, the USS Philadelphia dampened the possibility for success. The provisional government under Sanford Dole made the final appeal for annexation when the military necessity of the islands became apparent. Okay, so this is what the Navy is saying. We don't care what the local population says. This is a military strategic port. We taking it. End of discussion. 1898, as the U.S. attempted to transport troops, livestock, and equipment to the Philippines, the importance of the islands as a depot or reshipping point became obvious. Annexation was approved on 6 July 1898, and on 12 August 1898, the U.S. flag was run up over the palace. If you watch Hawaii Five-0, this is the palace that they're referring to, the one that they're using as their police station. So, talking about Pearl Harbor, almost 150,000 blacks served in the Navy alone during World War II. In 1941, Dory Miller, a messman. A messman is basically a person who works in the kitchen. Aboard the USS Arizona, was awarded the Navy Cross for shooting down 4 enemy airplanes during the attack on Pearl Harbor. If you have seen the movie with Ben Affleck, among others, about Pearl Harbor, basically it's Cuba Gooding playing Dory Miller. He enlisted, like other blacks, to fight, not to serve white officers as a waiter. And after his medal, so basically, after all the gunners who were trained to be gunners who were white basically were killed off. That's when he took over and shot down the enemy planes that he did. And after the battle, he was given a medal. He was sent on a national recruitment tour to induce other blacks to enlist. And his next ship assignment after that tour was back as a cook, not as a fighting man. And his ship was torpedoed and lost with all hands in 44. This, back home, this is the order basically for all persons of Japanese ancestry that are American citizens to report to concentration camps. And the collection point here in Eugene, 34 West 6th Street, 6th Avenue, Eugene, Oregon. So if you understand that Willamette Street is the dividing line for east and west, that's where the Halt Center is now. And that collection point was the Eugene or Heilig Theater. This is the rest of the order. Talking about how you can only show up with all the goods that you can carry for each person. Leave your pets and refrigerators behind. So another thing that will appear on a midterm or final near you is the issue of presidential executive orders. So how that works, what a presidential executive order is, the president's part of the executive branch. Congress, both House and the Senate, make the laws. The judiciary, including the Supreme Court, interprets the laws, and the president carries out the laws as the executive branch. The president can also sign executive orders. These are usually, following the laws of Congress and how these can be, how the laws will be carried out, particularly in wartime. So presidential executive orders are things to look at in terms of what their effects are on society. So these are wartime executive orders. So 8802 is the order to integrate the war industries. And basically what this is this was in response to A. Philip Randolph organizing the first March on Washington, which actually didn't occur, but he organized 100,000 black people to actually march on the Mall in Washington to protest discrimination against hiring black people in war industries. So the day before the march was to happen, basically the president signed the order integrating, an executive order integrating the war industries. "9066, Japanese internment, which basically is the legal, well, it's still legal today. It basically set up the precedent that we can round up American citizens on the basis of race and put them in concentration camps for any military necessity. And not just people of color, any Americans, in the interest of national security. Never been overturned. It's still in effect today.
What is like a label? Like, why is it labeled by the number?
What?
Why is it labeled by the numbers?
9066?
Yeah,
That's the executive order number. Right? So we're up to 15,000 now. Like affirmative action is like 1,100 something, 11,000 something. So that the label is their numbers.
What's the War Powers Act?
War Powers Act is an act of Congress, though.
Well,
Yeah.
that doesn't really fit in with this.
Yeah. 9095 executive orders. So these are World War II executive orders. 9095 establishes the alien property custodian. Now, the reason this stuff comes up in ethnic studies, well, part of it's obvious, right? It's the African American experience. So here we are, we're supposed to be part of a nation, we're citizens in a nation that's gone to war, and we're expected to pitch into the war effort. And that means jobs if we're not going to enlist in the armed services, right? So the first one is we're being discriminated against, so the president has to sign an order to allow us to actually work in the industries that other people are profiting from or getting jobs from. The second one basically says, along the lines of race, because your parents or great-grandparents came from another country, because remember the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, but the 13th Amendment, if you are born here, you're a citizen, period, end of discussion. These folks were born here, but because their parents or great-grandparents were from an enemy country, we're going to put you in concentration camps. No matter what you did, and most cases, well, all cases, they didn't do anything. But they were put in concentration camps, taken out of school, all kinds of stuff done to them, right? 9095, the alien property custodian. Now, what would you think that is from that name? Alien property. What kind of aliens are we talking about?
Foreign.